I'll introduce the speakers properly as they speak. My name's Simon Pirani. I'm going to moderate this evening. We've asked our panelists to keep it quite short at the beginning because we want to have as many questions as possible and points from you in the audience. So we want to make this very interactive. So without the subject is Greenwich Council's decarbonisation plans. How can we give them teeth? That's the title of this evening's session. So I'm going to go straight into the panel. We're going to ask our two councillors to speak first. First, Denise Scott-McDonald, who I believe is the deputy leader of the council. Is that?
Not quite.
Not
actually,
quite. Sorry.
Not quite. 7 o'clock tomorrow.
Excuse me. Oh, 7 o'clock tomorrow.
David, I still have to bow down to David.
Okay. Okay, so Denise is ascending to be the deputy leader of the council tomorrow. She's going to go first, then David. Then I'll ask Andrew Pendleton from New Economics Foundation, and then Chloe from Manchester Climate Emergency. That's the order we're going to go in. So Denise has some slides. I'm going to take a few more seconds of your time to bring those up on my screen. If you can all just bear with me. And I will share that screen with you all, I hope, if I can press the right buttons. And Denise will speak to those slides. Here we go, share screen. There we are. So Denise Scott-McDonald, thanks for joining us. There's your first slide, off you go, and just tell me when you want to move to the next.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Simon, for inviting me here, and thank you for the discussion, because I thought it'd be good to bring some slides to help with the discussion, and so they can have a visual aid of what's going on in Greenwich, where we are, and where we want to go. So if you move to the next slide. So what happened in 2018, some of you may remember, Bristol University, the city of Bristol declared a climate emergency, and that started a roller coaster of and a relay race of so many different councils declaring climate emergencies in different shapes and forms. Right now, I know there's 67 local authorities have declared a climate emergency. I know they all look, not all of them look the same. Here in London, there are 26 councils. Most of us in London have gone for the 2030 target to be carbon neutral. Some boroughs like Tower Hamlet has done it for 2025, while others like Merton has gone with the government target of 2050. But we have stuck with the carbon neutral target of 2030, and we did that when we declared a climate emergency in June last year. So far, we've put together an evidence-based report, which I will cover and skip through tonight. Do you want to turn to the next slide, Simon?
Yep.
The report, so basically the report shows the measures and costs associated with low carbon transition. So it's a 100-page report. It's quite detailed. And I'm assuming that a lot of people who are listening right now have looked at the report. So these slides will go through some of that. Go to the next slide, please, Simon. So because we've declared a climate emergency in the next 9 years, basically we're going to have to be incredibly ambitious. We're going to have to reduce vehicle trips by 45%, generate renewable energy, and increase energy efficiency in our buildings. Next slide, Simon. All right, so the report starts off of where are we? Where are we in Greenwich right now? So this data comes from last year, 2019. Greenwich carbon emission was 733 kilotons of carbon dioxide. If you look at the data, it's the two biggest contributors. The first one is our buildings. Domestic heat is 217, and quite close behind that is transport at 216. And there it just breaks down the data. I know, Simon, you said you wanted to, I don't mind sharing the slides later on so people can have a view of it later on. Do you want to go to the next slide, Simon? So the evidence behind that data, which you saw ahead, comes from two main areas. It's divided into three main areas, but the scope 1 and 2 are the ones that we can control, or we can, and also we can measure much more easily. Scope 3 is important, and we do have to do stuff about scope 3, but they're not things that we can measure or can make a difference to the carbon emission data. The first scope 1 is emission occurring inside the borough. So some of this data comes from stuff that we do in the council that we can collect, like landfill data and waste disposal. But also within that, you see aviation. Now, we don't have an airport here in Greenwich. However, what we have done is we collected that data from London-wide data, and we extrapolated where Greenwich would sit within that data. Scope 2, emissions taking place outside the borough, but arising from energy use in the borough, and there clearly lists there the district heating systems. And scope 3, again, air travel by residents, we can't measure. However, we may have some influence encouraging people not to take flights and to take trains. Travel outside the borough, we can encourage people to cycle and try and do that modal shift, so they don't just cycle or walk in Greenwich or take public transport in Greenwich, but they do it when they're outside of the borough. But then again, we can't measure that data or that information. Next slide. So this is the trajectory to carbon neutral. And if you start at if you look at the baseline, that sort of says if we continued on the path we're already on. So, and that was set from the Greener Greenwich strategy, which was the older climate change strategy. And as you can clearly see, we would be nowhere near zero at 2030 and nowhere near zero at 2050. If you look at that the line below that, still it's not ambitious enough, and it doesn't get us anywhere close to that 2030 target. But if you look at the last one, that's maximum ambition. It doesn't completely go to zero, and I think that's because we've got things like Victorian buildings and things like that, but we can offset the carbon for that. But that will take a lot of effort, not just as a council, but as a population, as the people of Greenwich, our industries, also with government legislation, also at the London mayoral level, as well as the national level. Things need to change for us to reach that target. Next slide. Here you can see what we can accomplish. If you look at the second column, if we do things as usual, we see a reduction of 27%. But then if you go all the way to the end, we can see a reduction of carbon emission of 89%. But that would include electrification of the grid and decarbonisation of the grid. And next slide. So this is about the actions. This is about things that need to be done. Now, on the report online, I've only got one slide for this, but in the report, there are 3 slides. Now, the 3 slides cover the phasing of what needs to happen to our building, the phasing of what needs to happen in transport, and the phasing that needs to happen with things like recycling, which I think David will cover later on. So this actually explains in the blue columns that talk about us as a council, what we need to do and the things that we need to do to get going. And then the stuff at the bottom in the grey, that's the external things that need to come into play. And you see things like the ULEZ, that's to do with the Mayor of London, making sure the ULEZ comes into play. And then later on, pushing for a ZEZ, which is a zero emission zone. So those are things that need to come into play also for not just us, but for many boroughs in London to reach carbon neutral. Next, Simon, please.
Yeah, that's the next slide. We're actually at 8 minutes, but do take 2 more because obviously it's a bit clumsy.
All right, so I'll gallop. So this is the listing of policies. There needs to be a whole series of policy changes in Greenwich, as well as at national and regional level. Next slide, Simon. All right, we can go to the next one. Hold on, go on. You can go to the next one. Those are more priority actions. If you go online, it has more detail about these priorities and where they sit and it has an amber red system so they know which ones are really important that we need to accomplish and which ones are quick wins. Keep going to the next slide, and the next, and the next, sorry. So far, so what happened, we've actually, the council has restructured itself, so it's got a governance structure now that takes into the carbon neutral plan and the climate emergency. So in terms of every single department in the council, there's a key person, they all meet together and they look at ways of tackling climate emergency, whether that's in the children's department or whether that's in the parks or whether that's in the transport team. The council doesn't have direct control. That's about lobbying and talking to our key stakeholders. We had a key stakeholder meeting in March 2020, which I know someone from Extinction Rebellion was also there, but we also had developers in the room, we had head teachers in the room, we had lots of local businesses, and they were all talking about what they can do about the climate emergency. Next one, Simon. There's a network that's been organised, which people can plug into and sign up to. And there was also a survey done of residents to look at the carbon neutral plan and say, what do you want Greenwich Council to prioritise, which hopefully tonight we'll hear some really good ideas for us with that. And the stuff is being analysed right now, and there should be a report coming up later in the year. Okay, I rushed through that last part, but.
Okay, Denise, thank you very much. Just to say to everybody, keep your questions coming in. We have Amarel monitoring the questions in the chat, and we'll try to sort of funnel those through to the speakers as we go. But now I'm going straight over to David Gardner, also a councillor. We're very grateful to you and to Denise for taking the time to join us. David, off you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, everyone. And I'm very pleased to be at another XR event, albeit on virtual event. So firstly, to sort of praise Extinction Rebellion. Actually, I think that Extinction Rebellion, including in Greenwich, has really changed the landscape in terms of the debate, and that the work that you've done and the pressure that you put on, I think, has been absolutely invaluable. I think that the energy that you've brought to the debate and the local focus has also been very positive. It's something that personally I've been very sort of passionate about for many years in all my political life. Always been a member of the Socialist Environment and Resources Association, which is sort of the Green Labour affiliated organisation, and always banged on about environmental issues long before it was fashionable. There is there's a very good I know Andrew will talk about this in a bit, but there's a very good list of Labour local authorities across the country. Denise mentioned Bristol, but there's Oxford, Birmingham, Leeds, and a large number of other Labour authorities, and obviously there are some Lib Dem and I don't know any Green ones anymore that are similarly blazing a trail in terms of climate change. In fact, when Ken Livingstone was Mayor of London, he set up this sort of C40 group of world cities that has really, I think, energized a lot of the global leadership, because in some countries like Brazil or in the United States, obviously, where governments are climate change deniers, often you look to cities and regions to provide the leadership. So what I want to do is just talk a bit about the London perspective, because we all work within this national and London policy framework. And I think what's happened at London level is extremely important and clearly influences what we will do in Greenwich. So in 2018, Sadiq Khan, as a relatively new mayor then, published the London Environment Strategy that focused very much on improving air quality, on reducing CO2. It set the 2050 ambition which I think is perhaps, needs to be revisited now. And obviously it set the way, it set the template really also for the draft London transport strategy, which is very much titled and focused on healthy streets. So that talked about, the environment strategy talked about climate change and energy, zero carbon by 2050, talked about waste, which I will focus on a bit, London being a zero waste city, 2026 no biodegradable recyclable waste, and 2030 65% of London's municipal waste will be recycled. So in Greenwich that means we nearly have to double our recycling rate to reach that. That London will adapt to climate change, obviously particularly in the heated centre, a green infrastructure including adoption of the National Park City, which I think was very welcome. I'm pleased now that I serve on the Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, which I think does a lot of good work in terms of creating green corridors. Air quality, London will have the best air quality of any major world city by 2050. It's a great shame, of course, that he's now gone and committed himself to the Silvertown Tunnel, which will hardly help that. And also on noise, and the quality of life will be improved by reducing the number of people adversely affected by noise. So it's about being greener, cleaner, ready for the future. And that really has set the tone for a whole series of policies the Mayor has produced. And I wanted to focus on the draft London plan because I think that is most significant. That is London's spatial development strategy, and that will have to inform. So every time we have a planning application, when we do our core strategy, our local spatial development strategy, that has to be based on what's called the London Plan, which is a London Spatial Development Strategy. And the draft really takes us forward in terms of where we were before under Boris on climate change. So again, it's the 2050 zero carbon. It upgrades the status of metropolitan open land virtually to the same as Greenbelt, which is very welcome. It says that developments should make a contribution towards a zero carbon target, and they should make a contribution also to improving air quality and to improving green coverage. It's slightly weak in terms of the greening impact of development because it mentions living walls and green roofs and so forth. So you can actually lose lots of parkland or trees, but as long as you have some living walls and green roofs, then you'll be all right. So there's a bit of a debate about that. It brings in what's called the urban greening factor, the UGF, which has been adopted by quite a few other councils and their development plans. And that looks at it sets a ratio really based around different environmental factors, including air quality and carbon and the impact on greenery. And it sets a target of 0.4 for residential developments and 0.3 for commercial developments, and now 0.2 for industrial developments. That actually is quite low. And there is some debate about whether that should be increased. I mean, it's good to set a target, but actually, I think it's 0.8 in Bristol, and 0. for residential, and 0.6 for commercial. So it sets quite a low target in terms of the urban greening factor for new developments, and that might be something that we want to press for changes on. It sets targets in relation to waste that I've mentioned, and it sets the whole framework really, both for local development strategies that each borough has to produce, and also individual developments that are called, many of which, of course, like some big ones in Greenwich recently, are called in by the mayor. There's an issue also around the embedded carbon and whether it's ambitious enough in terms of its 35% target in reducing embedded carbon in buildings, 35% improvement on building regulations 2013, and that's particularly relevant in terms of things like the Silvertown project, which uses a huge amount of concrete. And there's talk about the life cycle carbon costs, which I think is a good way of looking at it. So I think
David, could I ask you to wind up?
Oh, thank you, Simon. Sorry, getting carried away. So there are some very good aspects to it, but areas where it can be pushed further. So I just mentioned on Greenwich waste strategy. We had a recent consultation. We tried to refocus, so it's now about towards zero waste, following what Bristol did. So that had a very positive. We did a roadshow around the borough, had 6,000 people contribute, very positive, and people are up for doing what we can to change our waste system so that we do meet that target of 50% recycling by 2025 and 65% by 2030. We've got to think in terms of the circular economy, which is also very strong in the London plan. Finally, I'm just going to mention about COVID-19 and the impact. There are some very positive impacts in terms of improved air quality, reduced carbon emissions. I've been cycling everywhere, along with increased number of local people, which is brilliant. But also some concerning aspects. I think, particularly in terms of frightening people off public transport, which is driving more people to use their cars. There's been a big pickup in the last couple of days in terms of car usage, and concerns therefore about whether actually will reverse the good work that's been done in recent years to promote sustainable transport. So a big debate, but we should see this as an opportunity. Council's very clear about this, and we should see the response to COVID, the new normal, very much has the climate emergency at its heart and uses an opportunity to really embed sustainable transport and ways of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Let's move on now straight away and there's a lot of questions coming in. We see all those questions. Actually, but let's move on now to Andrew Pendleton. He's the Director for Policy and Advocacy at the New Economics Foundation. He's been working for many years on climate issues, and we're very pleased to have him with us and to offer some comment from a sort of outside perspective on our discussion about Greenwich. So Andrew, off you go.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. I'll be as brief as I can. Thanks, Denise and David, for the comments, and really, really good to hear more about the plan. I've had a quick skim. And Simon, and also to add my praise to Extinction Rebellion. I think the critical thing on climate change really in the next few years, and of course this is something that's challenged hugely by the current situation that we're in as well, is to continue to open up political space, because as I'll highlight, we're really way behind where we should be. We've been fiddling for a lot of years. It's definitely still doable. We definitely can still keep climate change below or keep global average temperature rises, and so therefore the impacts of climate change within sort of manageable human levels. But it's a tough call now. So a few years ago, it looked like we were winning the battle at the global level, and emissions began to level off between 2014 and 2016. But then they began to rise again in 2017, and they'd done so until 2019. And as David said, there are there's one aspect, I suppose, with relation to climate change that coronavirus is a good thing for. And I say that really guardedly, because I think it's a grim thing that is causing misery for an awful lot of people. So I hesitate to dwell on this as good news, but the latest estimates are that emissions this year will reduce globally by maybe around 5.5%. Is that good news? Well, sort of yes and no. So I guess yes, because at this point, any space for the climate is a good thing. And I also suspect it will have a suppressing effect on emissions for several years to come anyway. So for instance, I would expect demand for aviation, demand for flying, I would expect people's appetite for flying to be suppressed for a few years. And so therefore you would see probably not such a big decrease in emissions rather in future years, but still some maybe. So I think it will have an effect for 2 or 3 years. Maybe it's really hard to say because it's hard to know how long the crisis will persist. But the no bit is probably the more critical bit, unfortunately. And that's because not only is 5% decrease in global emissions not enough, we need to be, you know, by a lot of people's estimates, more than 7.5, 7.6% globally a year from now on to get anywhere near that 1.5 degree safe limit target, which is really where we need to aim. But it's also a no because the structure of the economy remains broadly the same. So there is the potential there for emissions to pick up again very quickly when the economy, if and when the economy recovers, if demand in the economy recovers. And as we can see, there's this really critical relationship between what we do in the economy and our quality of life and jobs and our ability to deal with the other big crisis that we face on the planet, which is inequality. And so in a way, we all want for the economy to recover, but what we don't want is for emissions to recover. So there's a really critical moment approaching us to do something about this problem. And in that respect, I suppose coronavirus gives us a brief sliver of an opportunity, which we may not otherwise have had. And I think aviation is a really good example of that because prior to the coronavirus emergency, the plans that the government had already, in theory, had in mind for the expansion of airports would have increased passenger numbers by nearly 100% over what the Committee on Climate Change year that they measure it, which is 2005, by 2050. And that's way, way beyond what the Committee on Climate Change, our climate watchdogs, if you like, in the UK, say we can go. Now, if the COVID emergency gives us an opportunity to keep demand low for aviation, then that could be a good thing, but it's not going to happen on its own. That will require government intervention. And it's a huge challenge in the UK for us to meet our emissions targets anyway. So really, regardless of whether you think 2050 is the right year for us to target to get our emissions down to net zero or zero, even better, the challenge is much more about the pace of reduction. So maybe the point is here that coronavirus, the COVID crisis, gives us a brief moment when we can increase the pace of reduction, because that's going to be the really critical thing. To get a little bit technical for a second, it's probable that in the next, in the process of getting to its 2050 targets or to getting to net zero, the UK has about 3 gigatons of carbon emissions, in absolute terms. That's not per year, that's over that period of time. That's the maximum amount we can probably emit as part of our global contribution, if you like. So even if we reduced emissions by 10% per year in the UK, and we've only ever done that once for a whole range of rather quirky reasons, we'd still bust through that budget of 3 gigatons by the mid-2030s. So in that respect, it's not so much the end year that matters, but how quickly we go. Because actually we might find we can do this by 2030, 2035, but only if we go quickly enough and only if we're ambitious enough now. So really what we do now is the most critical thing. And here's the really bad news, because what Greenwich is doing and what Denise and David have laid out in Greenwich and London is very good in aspiration. But the problem is that from the top down in the UK, the policy framework is not there for us to meet even our net zero 2050 targets. And that's not my word, that's the Committee on Climate Change, our climate watchdogs words. And in fact, we're going to start to be off track by as soon as 2023, because the fourth carbon budget period, 23 to 27, is when they say we start to drift off track. And that's because we don't have a coherent net zero policy framework in the UK. A really good example, both Denise and David have talked about the the importance of reducing emissions from buildings. Well, there is no zero carbon homes policy anymore in the UK because the current government, in its previous incarnation at least, got rid of it. And then there's nothing to replace it. We should not be building a single new home now in the UK that is not zero carbon. It just shouldn't be happening. And yet every building that's going up that I see around the corner from me, that you no doubt see wherever you live, going up at the moment is not net zero, and probably not even that well insulated and that good. So we've got a long way to go very quickly. Now, local authorities can do loads, and I just want to finish off by highlighting a few things, but there's one big elephant in the room, I think, in Greenwich, and it's not necessarily wholly under your control, but I think Greenwich can do an awful lot more, particularly now, about it. And of course, that's the massive expansion of the road network in Greenwich through the Silvertown Tunnel, which is really critical, because if that happens, then that creates, and we all know that when you create new roads, they fill up very quickly, and they create the potential, at least, for a lot more emissions through traffic. And there's no way we're going to hit our carbon targets just by electrifying the traffic that's currently on our roads, just by switching technology, because again, all of the projections say that you can only do it by a combination of some electric vehicles, but also reducing the amount of traffic, switching people onto public transport and onto more active forms of travel, walking and cycling. So for me, that would be a really—
Can you wind up, please, Andrew?
Sorry, Simon?
Can you wind up?
Yes, I'll wind up now. So for me, that would be a really critical thing for Greenwich to do, would be to target that one thing. But I just want to finish off with 3 quick things that need to happen and that maybe coronavirus gives us the opportunity to do. The first one is we need a national investment program, and coming out of this crisis, we're going to need fiscal stimulus. We're going to need to stimulate the economy. That has to be a green program, investment in renewables, in home, in commercial property, and so forth. We have to scrap plans now for airport and road expansion, and they'll all come under legal challenge anyway, following the court's decision on the Heathrow expansion recently. The really critical thing we can do literally today, and David mentioned this, and the opportunity is slipping through our fingers as we speak because the roads are refilling up with traffic, but really local authorities can do this, and that is take road space now while it's there. And you can do this because we need more space for pavements, because we need to be able to distance on pavements. In London, many of our pavements are very narrow, so take the road space before they start to fill up. Introduce these modal filters which stop cars going through certain roads to stop rat running. Take space on main roads as well. Don't be shy, don't be timid now, because if we miss this opportunity. So it's really impressive that the Royal Borough of Greenwich has set the target. It's really impressive you've declared a climate emergency, but the plans have to be really ambitious. And if we don't take these ambitious opportunities now, then we really are going to miss what we need to do.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, and thank you to all for keeping to time as best you can. Now, moving on to Chloe Jeffries. Chloe is part of the core group of Climate Emergency Manchester, and very happy to have her here, because that organisation has been monitoring the work of Manchester City Council and, well, these are my words, breathing down the council's neck and pushing it, and as hard as it's been able to do. And this is experience that we sorely need to learn about. And that's why we're very happy to have Chloe here. So Chloe Jeffries, off you go.
Thanks, Simon, for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak on this panel. It's been really interesting to hear the comments of the other panelists. I'm going to say a few words now, more from a campaigner, activist perspective, about Climate Emergency Manchester. I'll begin with a bit of context about what's going on in Manchester. Then, as per my brief, I'll say a few words about what has gone well over the past 18 months or so, and then what has not gotten so well. And really, I'm presenting this to you as a kind of case study of campaigners scrutinising council actions around climate change. So working on the basis that most of you are sitting at your homes in London, why is Manchester interesting related to climate change? Well, it's a large city region. The population of Manchester is just over 500,000. If you look at Greater Manchester, it's 2.3 million. The area's been a bit of a kind of lab experiment in local devolution recently. It has a high national profile. You could probably hear our Metro Mayor, Andy Burnham, on the radio on any given day of the week. Manchester has quite a strong voice in national and international networks around climate change. Turning to the council, it's a long-standing Labour majority. At the time of writing, there's 96 Labour councillors compared to 2 Liberal Democrats and 1 independent. Like all local councils, it's been hit very badly by austerity over the past decade, but perhaps in a slightly different way from some other councils. Its model of financing frontline services in response to this has become heavily dependent on the airport. And the council owns a large share and receives a large dividend from Manchester Airport. On rhetoric, Manchester likes to position itself as leading the way or doing things differently. And if I had £1 for every time I'd heard those 2 phrases, I probably wouldn't be sat here today. There's a long history of producing reports or responses to climate change, and some of this is quite quickly forgotten. The developments of 2019 to 20 that I'm going to talk about are not the first such attempt to respond to climate change. The kind of time frames are quite similar to those that you've talked about for Greenwich and local authorities around the country. So the climate emergency was declared in July 2019. We then went through quite a sort of slow process of actually getting an action plan, and a 5-year action plan, so taking us through to 2025, was approved in March 2020. So who are Climate Emergency Manchester? In brief, we're a non-partisan volunteer campaign group trying to connect citizens around climate change, and I might add, breathing down the council's neck, after Simon suggested that phrase. We've just had our first birthday. We set up in March 2019. Our initial focus was very much getting the council to declare a climate emergency. When that happened, largely due to external events, the emphasis shifted to the much harder and more important task of scrutinising the subsequent plans and pushing for deeds, not just fine words. What has gone well in that year or so? The first thing I'd like to flag is we've really benefited from the input of supporters in a multitude of ways that are not just about attending meetings. And even before lockdown, that was really at the heart of our strategy. You didn't have to be at an event in person to help us. And volunteer researchers undertaking kind of defined, time-limited tasks has really improved some of our briefings and reports. We've worked well with kind of coalitions of campaign groups to kind of produce templates and responses to critical local processes, most recently our local plan consultation. We sort of specialise in detailed reports, including quarterly assessments of the council's progress against its climate emergency declaration. So kind of taking apart that declaration, seeing it as a series of promises, and then just trying to track what, if any, action has been taken on those. And we do that using a mix of scraped data and also, where necessary, Freedom of Information Act requests. We've also, probably in the past 3 to 4 months, developed a repertoire of producing briefing papers before crucial council meetings. Now, these are much shorter documents with 3 to 4 headline recommendations, which we send out to councillors a few days before the meeting to inform their contributions. And on occasions, these have clearly intervened in the debate. A good example is the February meeting of the Council Scrutiny Committee that has climate change within its brief. And there, councillors, in quite an unprecedented fashion that was picked up by local journalists, pushed back against the processes set out. And they demanded much more clearly quantified and costed plans. The plans were kind of very, very vague, lacked numbers at that point. A number of recommendations that we made in our briefing paper a few days before became incorporated into the final action plan. Two to mention are the use of tonnes rather than percentages consistently in all documents, so talking in tonnes as we refer to it, and also reintroducing quarterly progress reports, which are much harder to hide progress or failure behind than annual reports. What has gone less well? Well, of course, not all our reports gain the same amount of traction, and we don't expect every request to be heeded by the council. But one thing I'd like to stress to you is that our success metrics as a group at Climate Merch Manchester are not just about influencing politicians. Skills and knowledge development and training citizens in local democracy is really central to Climate Emergency Manchester. And we've also produced a number of kind of beginners guides to local government to help others engage in these democratic processes that, let's be honest, are rarely taught at school. I'd also like to say that any kind of judgment on how well things are going is really dependent on the next few months. It's crunch time. And at Climate Emergency Manchester, we now want to apply some of those repertoires that we've developed over the past year to scrutinising Manchester City Council's response to COVID-19 and ensuring its green recovery. One thing that we're already trying to make clear is that a couple of the kind of high profile early announcements coming from Manchester City Council, one that's got a lot of attention is the move to pedestrianise a very small bit of the city centre, Deansgate, for anybody who knows Manchester, that those must not kind of just hog the limelight or become fire breaks or substitutes for some other measures which are also crucial to keeping within carbon budget, but perhaps they're a bit less flashy, they're a little bit more complex. We'll also, over the next few months, be pushing for transparency and openness because we're seeing worrying signs that committee meetings for climate change are being deferred until well into November. The Manchester City Council planning meeting has been suspended. Its powers have been deferred to the chief executive. And it looks like Manchester City Council may bail out the airport. So we can pick up on some of these points and questions, but just to sum up, I think Manchester is an interesting example to keep an eye on because it shows how campaigners can scrutinise local authority climate plans, deeds not words, and at the same time try and increase the skills and knowledge of other concerned citizens.
Okay, Chloe, thank you very much. Thanks to all our panelists. Now, we've got a big pile of questions here. I'm also very aware that for people to hold their attention on Zoom meetings is not so easy as if we were sitting in the community centre. So I'm going to try and direct things a bit from the chair. I'm going to start by asking some of the questions that have come in on the chat, but then I'll also invite people to ask their questions themselves. But I mean, there's two or three things where several people have asked, and I think the best thing for me to do is sort of wrap those up for our panelists. Can I just ask one question about the sort of rules of engagement? And this is specifically to Denise and David. I mean, there are some quite detailed questions here, which we might not get time to tackle this evening. Can we kind of agree right now that if there's stuff left over and we're all getting too tired and this has been dragging on for too long, I will bundle those up in emails and send them to you, and then we'll get a response which we'll then distribute in the XR Greenwich website. You're both nodding, that's fantastic. That's the sort of response I like. Right, so from the questions that have come in on the chat, well, Andrew's mentioned it, and let's get right to it. As several, I think 3 people have mentioned the Silvertown Tunnel, and somebody has said, so to put it in the words of Ferdi Suleiman, what is the Greenwich's post-coronavirus transport strategy? Policy experts are predicting a huge overcapacity on road and air transport. Should the council not now take a stance on this and call for a moratorium and a re-evaluation to this very expensive and highly damaging project, the Silvertown Tunnel? So whatever's happened before, is it not time? Or as another person, Alison Miller, said, can you now force the council to come out against the Silvertown Tunnel, not just to send Sadiq Khan a letter, because I know that's happened from the Labour group. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the council joining the other councils and publicly opposing the tunnel. And that question, I think, is specifically to Denise.
So you're right. Yes, we did actually send a letter to Sadiq asking them to pause. And you know, there was a long journey of the council changing its position on the Silvertown Tunnel, and now the council has changed its approach about it. I suppose it's a tough one there, because it's about I remember reading some of the blog sites and stuff talking about trying to get Sadiq to stop before he signed the PFR. And then there was a question about, if he does sign the PFR, it's going to be very expensive to get him to stop the tunnel. So, I mean, the decision lies with the mayor, and there's nothing wrong with us actually asking him or again, but in a sense, this project was signed off by the Secretary of State. It's got a PFI. It's a tough one. I'm not going to say it's an easy one. It's a tough one. But I know Greenwich Council is. Go on. What?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong. The letter which went from to Sadiq Khan went from the Labour group. That's not the same as that's not the same as a council decision, such as the decisions taken by other councils. Isn't it time? The question that's been asked is, in view of what's happened with coronavirus, which has hit TfL terribly hard in terms of its finances, that seems to be an absolutely illegitimate grounds for now the council to do what it should have done a long time ago, in many people's opinion. The council, to say, as a council, we now swing and go with the other councils and call on Sadiq Khan. Yes, it's going to be expensive, but better to back out now before it's more expensive.
Well, I can definitely take it back for an internal discussion for us to have that discussion, and that's what I can do. I can't make the decision because we have a process of making the decision about it, but I can definitely take it back, because I do know that COVID-19 has raised up some issues to do with, you know, finance and all that sort of thing. But it's definitely something I can take back. I can't make a decision right now on your show. I don't think that's appropriate. And since we have a democratic process internally, and you're right, it was a Labour group decision, and that's with, you know, obviously I haven't had those discussions with my colleagues. Also, at the same time, I do have to preface, this is the last day in the job of transport portfolio. So it's also a discussion that the new person should engage with as well.
Okay, that's good. And I just David wants to come in quickly on that, and I think Andrew, please keep it brief so that we can move on. David.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for raising this question. Thank you for keeping up the heat on the Silvertown Tunnel. I mean, I've always, as people know, it's no secret, I've always personally had grave doubts about this project ever since it was first put forward many years back. I think a disaster. I think generally I agree with a no new roads policy throughout the country. We're spending 25 billion on roads or something like that in the current MTFS nationally, and that should be all diverted to living streets and sustainable and active travel. And I agree. I think the difficulty with the Silvertown Tunnel, and I very much oppose it, and agree that the council should very much join with Lewisham, Newham and Waltham Forest and so forth, and speak out on it as much as we can. The difficulty we have is the DFBO, a design, finance, build and operate. The contracts have been signed. TfL actually stand to lose significantly in terms of financial penalties now if they pull out. But whether they can put a brake on, we need to look at the fine print. So given TfL are on the, you know, on the verge of financial almost collapse, and they've really got to draw in their belts with the COVID-19 crisis unless they get emergency funding from the government. This is not somewhere they can actually save money by pulling pulling Silvertown. What we all need to work together is to convince TfL that it is totally, and the mayor politically, that it is totally inconsistent with the mayor's environmental strategy, transport strategy, London plan, and most importantly, of course, our climate emergency. And that's what we need to convince people of, because he still holds to this view somehow that it will actually improve air quality, which we know, I think, is just not even proven by TfL's own evidence. But I think we do need to keep up the pressure on that, okay. And the more pressure from XR, the better.
Thanks very much, David. And just a quick point's been made on the chat by XR Greenwich. Surely any contracts are subject to a force majeure clause, which might be relevant due to the impact of COVID-19. And Andrew.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was a similar point, really. If you can't work out how to break those contracts now, I mean, over the whole period of PFIs and outsourcing, councils have got themselves into all sorts of long-term contracts that cause all sorts of problems now. So if there's any way it can be broken, I think there is no way that this scheme was ever compatible with either clean air or a clean climate. And it's even more not going to be now as a result of all the factors that have been mentioned. The sunk cost fallacy is always really important. So I realize this isn't all public money, but that don't keep pouring money into something that is a waste of money, basically. It's best to stop, even if you're some way in and it's going to cost them. We've been making the same argument, for instance, on HS2. And it will always cost the public purse loads of money. It's always going to cost you loads of money anyway. So even if projects are broadly privately financed, like Heathrow expansion, the public costs of facilitation are enormous. The public costs of dealing with the health impacts are enormous. The public costs of dealing with air pollution are enormous. And they're all dumped on the public sector and on people and on our NHS and so forth. And so in the round, it's going to be a lot cheaper to get out of those contracts, would be our argument.
Right, thank you very much, Andrew. Now I'm going to stay on, I've got, just to tell you what's coming up, we've got some very good questions on housing and renewables, especially from our friends at South East London Community Energy who've joined us, and I'll get to those in a minute, but now we're on transport. Janet Stott asked in the chat, can't we have, and look, if anybody, Janet, do you want to ask your own question? I mean, I'm just doing this to speed things up, but I can't see Janet here. Where is she? I still can't, oh, there she is. Do you want to ask your own question about the one-way streets?
I would like my husband, Robin, to ask.
Go for it.
It was I who put the question. Sorry, we're doing a joint thing.
Teamwork is good. Go for it.
Yeah. My question was: it is surely the time for us to make all streets in Greenwich one way, have parking only down one side maximum, and use the saved space for active transport, bicycling and walking, and at the same time planting trees and shrubs down those newly liberated street spaces. Also for kids playing outside and all sorts of other health and community benefits.
Yeah, thank you. And that, I mean, there's other people who've said on the chat that Andrew's also mentioned it when he was talking, that the need to seize this opportunity now. The number of cars has been reduced. So anybody on the panel? Denise, yeah, please.
Okay, so I agree with Andrew. I agree about seizing the opportunity, especially now. And I think it's really important, especially because a lot of people are walking and cycling. They feel safe to cycle. But at the same time, there is a concern about driving and more people in their cars, and we need to keep a hold of that. In terms of one way, I do have to put some caution here. There's a lot of data that shows when there are one ways created, it leads to speeding. So you do have to be very, very careful where you put a one-way system in, because it can do that, because people assume that no one's coming in their direction and they can go ahead speeding. Grow more trees, definitely. alternate parking. I lived in New York, and they had alternate parking, but it was to clean the streets actually. But it's a great idea, and I'm sure that we can do. I can take that back and ask the transport team. But in terms of taking the opportunity now, I think it's really, really important. And I think we're going to come out with some ideas very, very soon. Or my person taking over will be coming out, because we're looking across the borough at ways we can take advantage of this time of the lockdown.
Okay, well, there's a follow-up here, which is Denise. Why are Greenwich so slow to make temporary street changes during this crisis that we've seen in numerous other boroughs? Okay, so I apologies for being slow. If it is going on, we've set up a task force right now, and what we've done is we've looked at pinch points across the borough. A number of people have put in suggestions about certain things that they've seen throughout this time. So the task force is coming together. It's looking at certain projects. We're looking at projects we already have consulted on to see how we can actually do some temporary measures and to put into place. So some of the projects we've already consulted on, there's some work there that we can do to put some temporary measures in. We're also looking at funding. We're looking to get some funding from TfL for some other projects. I know the government said that they were going to give some more money. But yes, we've been a little bit slow, but it's coming. I can guarantee it is coming, and we are looking at pinch points across the borough. We're looking at improving social distancing. So, but there are some more announcements coming. I think there was an announcement today about some ideas. We're doing also some school streets with some of our schools, and some other ones are coming. So, and also with Greenwich Town Centre and some other ones. So they're there. They're in. The team is working on it. And I apologise for taking a little bit long, but we are working on it, and it's okay. I think David, if you want to come on that, extremely quickly, and then we're going to move on.
Okay, the statement's up. We're working on. The statement's gone up this afternoon on the council's website. We're working on in taking out parking bays and so forth in the town centres, widening pavements in the town centres. But also what I would say is what actually makes a difference here is local people presenting petitions, coming to council, coming to the highways committee. We've got to take local people, and I know this through bitter experience, we've got to take local people with us in this journey. So on the one hand, yes, absolutely, like Waltham Forest, the council needs to show leadership, but also we need local people saying, yes, this is what we want in our streets. And the more XR can get involved in local action to get streets closed or made one way, or what I call living streets with effectively no through roads, except on bus routes. All, in my view, all roads apart from bus routes should be no through roads, but we do need to take people with us on this because you've got to go through a process. But yes, we're already taking emergency measures and they will be rolled out in the next few weeks.
Okay, thanks very much. Now I'm going to something which will kind of take us from transport towards renewable electricity is a point that Lawrence Pinturo has made on the chat, which is that she wants to challenge the strong focus on electric cars. Now, our friends from South East London Community Energy add to that. Just let me look back a little. Yes, there's a fair amount, say, Celsi, in the carbon neutral evidence base about electric vehicles. However, and I strongly agree with this, and I've done some research on this in the past. However, electric vehicles are not low carbon unless they are charged via renewables, and in particular rooftop solar. And I would add, they can actually be worse than some types of diesel and petrol cars from a life cycle carbon point of view. And Celsi's point is, it seems to them that ambitions relating to electric vehicles in the council's plans are not matched by those relating to rooftop solar. In other words, if you have electric vehicles and you don't have rooftop solar, the danger is that your drivers will go out and buy electric SUVs, which are now coming into fashion, and we'll be nowhere further forward in terms of carbon, because the idea of urban transport without cars and without SUVs will not have come into the conversation. So anyone on the panel got anything on that? Well, yeah, David. You know, you've muted again.
It's about, I think electric vehicles halve the amount of emissions of conventional petrol or diesel cars. But obviously, you're right, if you take account of the life cycle carbon, it could be worse. I think the worst thing is thinking that electric vehicles are a panacea, because you're still using up the road space, you've still got the tarmac, and indeed many people may feel more in their comfort zone. They've got an electric vehicle, that's green, and therefore no need to cycle, walk, or get public transport. But there will be essential journeys, there will be essential vehicle users, there will be things like business deliveries and trades that require vehicles, and those should be electric. And that's what the council obviously focused on, making sure its own fleet is electric, and encouraging business users to use electric vehicles or cargo bikes and so forth. So I think that has to be our focus, but I quite agree it's not a panacea. I don't know too much in terms of the solar side and how that would about the charging points that we're putting in around the borough. Denise might know a bit more about that, but I'd be keen to learn if there are available and affordable solar solutions to electric charging points.
Okay, Denise, do come back on that if you want to. Can I just ask you, though, David, I mean, are our friends from Chelsea making a fair point that the council's document needs to be looked at again from that point of view?
I agree. Yes, I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, I think yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for that suggestion. That's a really good. Yeah, that's very good information.
Okay, right. And also, Chloe has pointed out that Manchester Climate Emergency Manchester, has just blogged on this very issue. And I see that she's put the URL in the chat. You can copy and paste that. And I see, without having read the article, that its title is "Things That Won't Save Us, #1, Private EVs."
Yeah.
So that gives you...
Just to say, this is a new series of blogs by one of my fellow core group members, Callum, and I just think it's a really nice overview of why private EVs may have their perks, but they're not going to save us. These are not the answer. So go there for a really neat summary. I think you'll find that a useful starting point.
Okay, thanks. Now, I want to move on to buildings. There's also some things about process and how exactly the council's interacting with the rest of us. We'll come on to that, but I want to go back to the question. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat and finding, yes, this is the other one from CELSI, the South East London Community Energy, who've been working for years on these questions of trying to develop community energy, of trying to develop small-scale renewables in this borough and others. They say that they notice that there's a one-stop shop is mentioned for energy efficiency and renewable heat in the document. I sense some irritation in their question. Because the person who's written it says, and it just says CELSI Energy Advisor here, the person who's written it says, whilst I applaud this aim, I was dismayed, because this is exactly what CELSI has been trying to do in partnership with Retrofit Works, and they've put a URL there which points to their website, which I know reports on all this work they're doing. Progress is slow, says CELSI, because we've been doing this on an absolute shoestring. Does Royal Greenwich aspire to work with existing community initiatives or to compete and set up a wholly local authority driven one-stop shop? I think that's for you, Denise.
Oh gosh. I am familiar with some of the things that South East London Energy does. I mean, I know that in the report it does say one-stop shop, not just on energy, but on all the different other actions. It does talk about a one-stop shop. I think that approach, that talks more about I suppose the approach we want to take, because sometimes people accuse the council of having things all over the place. And I think the whole notion of the one-stop shop was basically so that people could come to one place and find out as much information as possible and get the very information that they need. In terms of it being competitive, I don't think the council is interested in competing against, because I know the work of this organisation, and I know it's a lot of the work they do is very, very good. So I would say no. But I'm more than happy to engage with South East London Energy.
So just to clarify that.
But then
so
I'm not the person.
Sorry.
Go on. No, go on. Go on.
Well, I mean, to clarify that, if they, following this meeting, email you and suggest some dates where they can come into the council with a presentation about their work and explain how they've been doing this for many years, would you be able to assemble some of your colleagues who are working on this to listen to such a presentation and learn from what they've done?
Okay, so let me just make contact with them and have a conversation with them first to just try and tease out a little bit more about it, and then I can go from there. But then I do have to preface it, I am not going to be doing, I won't be the main person in charge of this portfolio. It will be the new cabinet member in that role. So. Okay.
Right. Now, I do have some other questions on the chat, but there's been an awful lot of me talking. Does anybody either who's had a question on the chat that I haven't done yet, or who hasn't, anybody want to say anything? We've got some about process. We'll come to a bit. It's 8:10. I think we can keep going for another. I think we got another few minutes, and then we'll get to the ones on process. But anybody got a question that is burning in their mind? Just here's Helen. Yeah, Helen, off you go.
Okay, just give me a second.
I've unmuted you.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I put 2 long questions at the beginning of the chat, and it's really about how in the key sort of topic areas that you're using in the report that was taken to council on the 28th of January 20, is that there's this concentration obviously on buildings, transport, energy generation, and what you don't have in there is this an actual heading that talks about our natural assets, and the natural assets that we have a major role in being able to stabilise and reduce carbon emissions. The whole management of natural systems can actually contribute to the beneficial life in a city in numerous ways: environmental, social, psychological, all the rest of it. And I don't think there's anybody paying enough attention on this level, which must be harnessed to solve the problems, because it's part of our environment. And the questions are quite long. I hope you can take them back and look at them and actually look at who is going to be driving this project forward within the council. And there's a massive chunk of environmental, landscape and climate science that's missing from your document, and it really does need addressing. Okay, thanks. Just a second, Louis, Denise, sorry. I'm going to bring in as well just another question from Lawrence. I've unmuted you. Yeah, so please.
Thank you. Thank you. In support of what this lady has just said, Greenwich has a number of very high quality ancient woodlands. These woods are the subject of substantial antisocial behaviour, including serious damage by motorcycle scrambling. What is the council doing to tackle antisocial behaviour in these woods to protect these woods from degradation? My second question is about housing growth. Substantial housing growth is proposed in Greenwich and Thamesmead over the next 10 to 20 years. How are we measuring the carbon footprint of the construction phase of these buildings? Because it's all well and good to say we are building very low emission buildings which are well insulated and so on, which I agree with, but we are not looking at the cost of construction, the steel, the cement, the additional traffic and so on. Thank you.
Okay, so there's 2 points there, one about the natural assets and the woodlands, and the other about buildings, the new buildings. Anybody on the panel? Denise, yeah. Sorry, you're not, I'm trying to unmute you. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in terms of I think Helen was, hi Helen and Lauren. In terms of the natural woodland, and the reason why some of the stuff was left out of the report is focusing mostly on things that we can measure and things that we can measure that will enable us to meet our 2030 target. And I think if I'm reading right what Helen's talking about, and she's right, those areas of the natural system are very, very important and are things that we can do to address them. But some of those things won't necessarily help us measure our carbon footprint in the short term. If I'm reading completely right, what she's talking about, those natural systems within Greenwich. So we're talking about things that we can measure. Okay, and so in terms of the ancient woodlands, that's actually absolutely awful what's going on, Lauren, and to do with the ancient woodlands and with antisocial behaviour. I do know we are in contact with the police about some of this, and some of it is also about finding out where exactly some of the if it's young people doing it, where are they from, where are they living, kind of sort of working out what time a lot of this stuff happens, and then feeding that into the police and local connections to see if we can do something. We do have a team on the council that does work locally with the local police and with local stakeholders to find out if they can address these things. But it depends on the nature of it, and they need much more detail about it.
Okay.
Does David, you want to do the
I was going to just come in on the on the parks and the natural. I mean, I'm often in Oxley's Wood, for example, or on Woolwich Common, and these are issues, but they've been issues as long as I can remember. Actually, about 20 years with scooters and things. We've set up a new. There are two things really. Firstly, we've set up this new Safer Spaces team, which is largely focused on the town centre, but I've seen them in Charlton Park and other areas and so forth. So I think, I think, and the police have been successful in stopping some of the abuse. Secondly, we've got 95 parks in Greenwich open spaces. We're very fortunate. And we do have a large number of Friends of Parks groups, including most recently the Friends of Woolwich Common, which I'm involved in, and some others are here. And they do make a big difference in actually being champions for those natural green spaces and parks. We're also doing a lot on wilding parks. And the other thing we agreed in this year's budget is, despite the fact that overall we're making cuts, within the medium-term financial strategy, we've agreed £2 million additional to go on a sort of a parks investment fund to really upgrade our parks and open spaces. So clearly we'll want to work with local people, the Friends groups and XR Greenwich and others who are interested in how we can use that to improve biodiversity of our natural and open spaces. And I'd like to see more pocket parks and so forth as part of our Living Streets agenda. On buildings, clearly, as I mentioned before, on the draft London plan, when that is adopted, once we're through the COVID-19, that will mean that our any big developments in Greenwich will have to take account of the life cycle costs of the embedded emissions in construction and so forth, as well as what its energy efficiency rating will be when it's actually built and lived in. And so I do think that it's important we measure up to that. I see Councillor Dillon's on the call. He's on the meeting. He's on the planning board, and that's clearly an issue the planning board need to look at when we get these plans before us. But the London plan will provide a new measure and new framework, and we need to make sure that we are keeping to that and really pressing developers to minimise carbon in construction. But we can't move away from the fact that the biggest issue we face on the doorstep as councillors is, I mean, while climate emergency is a big issue, the biggest issue we face is homelessness and overcrowding. So we still have to ensure we can provide new housing for local people.
Okay, anything else from the panel on? No, okay. Now, I think Janet's got a quick point. Janet, just before you come in, two things. One is that we're going to then move on. There's a couple of things about process and how the council is interacting with all of us. And I think that, you know, then we're going to draw it to a close, because as I said, it's quite hard to concentrate. Congratulations to all of you. Can see you from your faces, you've been paying incredibly close attention. So, but we'll I think go on to those process questions, but let's take Janet first. Janet, yeah.
I wonder, when Denise was going through her green papers right at the beginning, I noticed that there was a statement about disinvestment. And I wanted to know what the council was doing about that, from divesting from carbon intensive industries and organisations and reinvesting in renewables. And I wanted to know what progress they were making in that.
Right. Okay. Anything on that?
I do know the pension committee is looking into that and looking into our investments. So I do know. I don't know, David, do you know anything more on that? I think Peter.
Yes, I mean, this is a we did adopt last year some new principles in terms of our investment fund, the Greenwich Pension Investment Fund, which did include sustainability and other ethical criteria like child labour and human slavery and so forth, modern slavery. So those are now embedded. I do think, though, that there's still a way that we can go in terms of using our or the pension funds holdings to in companies, particularly those involved in carbon, to sort of ask the right questions and work with other ethical investors and public sector investors to get policy change and try and force policy change on companies. But certainly divestment is quite a live issue, and of course in recent years it's actually been a bad investment to have had too much money in the big hydrocarbon companies.
Okay, now
there is some work going on, and I think the question, the woman that asked the question, I'm sorry I forgot her name, I would encourage her to keep an eye on it, but there's supposed to be a report coming up from the pension fund.
Okay, thank you. Just very, very quickly, I don't want, Layla has just said the CIV is now hosting a Sustainable Equity Exclusion Fund in which Lambeth has invested 200 million. Can we look into this? Layla, please, I've unmuted you. Tell us what CIV is and anything else. I know you've been campaigning on this for a long time.
I don't want to take up too much time because it's incredibly tedious, but the compared to some of the other topics on this, which has been brilliant, and thank you everybody who's spoken. The CIV is the collective investment vehicle, and it's where all of our boroughs have pooled their money into, or gradually are pooling their money into. And I think 2 weeks ago they've announced that they are hosting a sustainable equity exclusion fund, which is a fossil-free fund, which is extraordinary because the CIV were sort of the establishment of the establishment within the pension world. Lambeth have invested 200 million already into it, and so it's a very viable thing to do now. I think from other people on this call, the pushback from Greenwich was going, if you get a fund that we can invest into, we'll invest that fund into. And now that there's a fund that we can invest ethically into, I think the question is, when can we do that?
Oh, cool. Oh, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And I mean, when I've listened to some people talking about funds, they said if the pension funds all across the country, if they actually walked with their feet and started de-investing, it would send a very, very strong signal. So I think that's a great idea. So I don't know who you spoke to, but yes, definitely let them take a look at it. I mean, I can't make the decision, so I'm not the person that does the pension fund. I don't sit on the pension fund committee. That's not me. But if they've said that to you, I know that there are many councillors, many people that want to see Greenwich actually do more with its pension fund and be much more ethical with it. So yeah.
Okay, that's great. Continue that, correspond with each other if need be outside of this. Thank you both. Andrew, I think you had a quick point on that, and then we'll move on to the final set of questions.
Well, I was only going to say really, and this goes for the London pool pension investments as well as each borough by borough, is there's also a massive opportunity for boroughs to invest in productive assets in their own borough rather than pushing it through financial markets, rather than pushing through capital market.
Good point.
So for instance, in social housing stock, because not only should there be not a single home built in London that's not zero carbon, now there should not be a single home built in London that's not affordable, because we don't have a problem with the volume of housing in London per se, we have a problem with its affordability. And that's the really key thing to tackle. Councils can do an awful lot by mobilising their own funds. Those sorts of things, investments in renewable energy that pays back productive assets would be a really important way to invest and get returns from pension money, and probably over time more reliable than the capital markets.
Okay, thank you. Now, when I talked about process, what I had in mind, I've got a question here from XR Greenwich. Guys, do you just want me to read this out, or does one of you want to? Karen, do you want to? It's about, because of the lockdown, the consultation has been delayed. I'll say it, and if you want to add something, add it. So because of the lockdown, says XR Greenwich, the consultation on the decarbonisation plan has been delayed. That's the Greenwich Council decarbonisation plan. Given that the lockdown is expected to be protracted, whatever confusing message we might have got yesterday from number 10 Downing Street, could the council begin to digitally undertake this consultation fully and transparently within the next week or two? The current decarbonisation plan is a great springboard for a more ambitious process that could see us as a borough leading through example, but it needs scrutiny by experts and by the public. Will the council consider engaging a citizens' assembly to examine, take responsibility for, and feedback on the plan? Anybody? Denise.
Okay, yeah. Right, so yes, we do want people engaging with the carbon neutral plan. I can't guarantee it will be done this week. I think the priority actually in the council is COVID-19 and anything to do with COVID-19 and addressing things to do. I'm really sorry. I know that we're dealing with staff. Some of them are self-isolating. Some of them many of them, most of them are working remotely. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now, but a lot of the focus is on COVID-19 right now. So I'm sorry, I can't guarantee that will happen. I can say one thing is that we are doing what we can. So my understanding is that the team that's working, which is a very tiny team right now, working on the carbon neutral plan, they are doing what they can do at their desk. So they are looking at ways to continue some of the paperwork behind it. But in terms of engagement, we are trying to, I mean, everything's gone online right now. I mean, so many things have gone online because of COVID-19, so many things have gone online. So we are looking at that. But I can't guarantee it will be this week. And not only that, there's lots of other people who want to engage too, but they won't be able to engage online as well. So.
Can I just come in something here, Simon?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I mean, this just touches on a couple of points that I mentioned at the end about what we were doing looking ahead. And for anybody on the call who is, concerned or a campaigner, I think this kind of monitoring of, have things been shelved? Are they moving online? Is the date realistic? Is a real thing for us to be monitoring over the next 6 to 12 months. Because we're in touch with quite a lot of different groups around the UK, and we're finding there's real discrepancies between how different local authorities have interpreted what they're supposed to do, and some have moved their meetings quite quickly online, others have not. Of course, there is the immediate response, but I think we've got a job to do in making sure that things don't slip unduly, and when it's appropriate for things to be moved online, that happens. But if anybody wants to get in touch with me about kind of instances of kind of good practice or particular committees that I know have moved online, we're kind of gathering quite a bit of that information. So yeah, keep monitoring, make a list of dates of when things should have happened, and if they haven't moved online, ask why and ask when.
Thanks.
But I agree. But there are a group of people also in Greenwich who are not online or don't necessarily want to engage online, and so there's a work that needs to also be done there, and they do want to engage with the carbon neutral plan too. So I agree with in terms of online stuff, but there are people who have been campaigning on the environment for quite some time, and they want to. They want to engage on a carbon neutral plan and see and push the council as well, but they're not all online too. So we do have to be mindful of that as well.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, did you have something? No. Okay. So I think we're coming to the end now. So in response to those points about the process and the consultation, I'm going to say two things. One is a comment that has been put up here. Sorry, I'm just finding it. It's very relevant. Yes. So somebody has asked about Denise, you've talked about coronavirus, and clearly that's taking up a huge amount of everybody's capacity.
Yeah.
I think, and I'm sure you and we would all agree that clearly we've got to look at the climate issues from the place we're standing, and the place we're standing is in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. And also I've got a kind of personal campaign against this phrase, when the coronavirus crisis is over. I'm afraid it's not going to be over for a long time, not until they find a vaccine, which they might never find, and perhaps not even then. And in fact, we need to be thinking in terms of interconnected crises, which have been caused by the human economy and the way it bumps around with the natural environment in which we live. And that brings me to a point that's been made by somebody on the chat, which is he's asked about COVID and new jobs before we go back to as normal. Let us retrain, he says, the huge numbers who've lost their jobs for socially useful work benefiting the environment. Labour has the Green New Deal policy. This opportunity should be seized before it's lost. So now I think that's G. Browning. Yeah, do you wanted to say something? Off you go.
I'm a she, not a he.
Oh, excuse me. I'm terribly sorry.
I couldn't find out how to put my name in. I made about 4 comments and couldn't find it. No, I mean, the points had already been made about it's so important. I feel very, very strongly that if we lose this opportunity created by this awful virus, it's going to be much more difficult to do the changes, once normality, so-called, has re-established itself. We should be looking now, not just at widening streets, we should be looking at diverse forms of transport, things that haven't been done in this country, use of minibuses, all sorts of things, to if we're going to get people from their cars. Not everyone can cycle, not everyone can walk, and not every situation. We need, with the jobs, there's all these people being made redundant in the aircraft industry. We should be looking like the Green New Deal, Labour Party Green New Deal said. We should be looking at ways of getting them working in environmentally, socially useful jobs. It's possible. Look at the number of firms have come to the rescue of the government's inability to provide PPE, proper protection, and have started changing from producing confectionery to actually producing masks and things, in a very short space of time. They've shown that people can do other things rather than doing what is destroying this country. I don't know whether people heard Jane Goodall being interviewed on radio Channel 4 about 2 or 3 weeks ago. She's talking about how the environment, jobs, pandemics, the way we look at nature, how we look after our green spaces is all interrelated, and how it's affected pandemics in the past. And if we don't change the way we live, then we'll have more pandemics. And that goes back to that question that you were saying about the money, or the other guy was saying about the costs it costs to change the Silvertown decision, but actually the costs, if we don't, are much, much greater.
Okay.
Sorry, gone on.
No, not to apologise. Thank you very, very much. Now I'm going to read out 2 more things from this chat. I must apologise if anybody's been on here and the question hasn't got in. Denise and David have very kindly agreed that any questions directed to them, we will forward to them. I'm going to give all the 4 panel members if they want 1 minute after I've read out these 2 things, they're very welcome to it. So the 2 things are, first one is from Daniela Vega. Why is the council's plan called the carbon neutral plan rather than zero carbon? How much will you rely on offsetting? And the other one is from Fiona Moore. She wants to know about next steps and how we stay involved. She would like to suggest that the council convenes a SAGE type group of local experts to advise on the plan. One would hope that such a group would actually have notice taken of it, unlike the actual SAGE type group that exists for the government. And Fiona says this group could then take forward this conversation and advise on how the council can best increase its ambition. So there's 2 questions. Everyone on the panel, let's take you in the reverse order from which you spoke at the start. Try and keep it to 1 minute each, please. So Chloe, off you go.
Yeah, so my summing up point is it isn't a competition. Local authorities shouldn't be in competition with each other. This is an issue which touches on many areas. It may be that one local authority is trying out something first or earlier. So let's learn from each other, both of those of us that are involved at a kind of local government level, those of us that are involved more at the think tank level, and those of you that are involved in kind of campaign groups. Just look at best practice elsewhere.
Thank you, Chloe. And Chloe, could you put an email address for climate emergency into the chat?
Yeah,
I know I've got it, but other people may want to get in touch with you from.
And please do get in touch. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much, Andrew.
I mean, I just 100% agree with Chloe. The importance of citizen action and scrutiny is really key. Collaboration between local authorities. People don't live in local authorities, they live in neighborhoods and places. The collaboration that takes place between local authorities is going to be absolutely critical, particularly in what I suspect will continue to be an absence of clear national planning on the climate emergency. So the role of local authorities is absolutely critical. So it's hugely encouraging to see plans coming forward, but so much of them are at the moment dependent on what national government does. And at some stage, you're going to have to break the leash and do it yourselves, because it's not going to happen from the top down, or at least not at the pace that we need. So there's a massive role for local authorities in being bold and accelerating this change. Somebody mentioned citizens' assemblies in the chat, and I'll finish on this point, but I do think they can help give local authorities the support and backing that they need. There's a lot of literature on how useful citizens' assemblies are in bringing together consensus on issues, and I'd strongly urge Greenwich and other boroughs to do that.
Okay, just before David comes in, a technical point from me to the our wonderful group of people who's been pressing all the buttons. Could somebody please copy this entire chat into a place where I can see it and send it to me on email or something, and then I shall go through and make sure that any of the questions that weren't asked are forwarded as we decided. I'm afraid I'm not technically capable of doing that. So
no problem.
Yep, Joan has got that. Fantastic. Right. Okay, David.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks everyone for joining this evening. I think it's been highly valuable. I think Greenwich is not perfect, but we have broadly a good record. If you looked at Friends of the Earth sort of ranking of authorities and where they are in terms of their carbon neutral plans, Greenwich was, I can't remember, I think we were second or third nationwide. I was quite pleasantly surprised really when I saw that. I can send you the link. But the the input that you can make and the pressure that you and others can bring and local groups can bring is really important to hold our feet to the fire. I've certainly in my time, and Councillor Faye here has been on the council a lot longer than me, but in my time I've seen quite a big change, and Greenwich has become far more attuned to these issues. But now, as I move from being deputy leader to the back benches, I will certainly be and continue to be a very strong champion for living streets and for more action on the climate emergency over all the areas we've talked about today. What I would say, two things. Firstly, is we do need to be mindful of resources. The council's, very overstretched in terms of our commitments, particularly now, obviously, with COVID, as against what our revenue streams are, which are somewhat challenged at the moment. So we do have to be very cognizant of that and put things in terms of, investments that will make sense and reduce future spending. And secondly, we need to put things in terms also of how action will help the most vulnerable in our society, because we're very, very focused on tackling health inequalities and wider income inequalities in the borough, which are far, far too large. We are a borough, sadly, of two halves, with obviously quite a few in the middle. So we do have to think very much in those terms as well when we present our arguments. But do please keep it up. I think it's been very useful this evening, and look forward to seeing many of you at the full council meeting and our various scrutiny committees and so forth, and involved in local planning and highways decisions, putting the case.
Thank you very much. And Denise.
Okay, so I agree with Andrew, Chloe, and David, and a lot of the things that people were saying tonight. When the council declared a climate emergency, within a few days, I was out in Eltham, actually at school, and some group of parents came up to us as councillors and said, "Here, what is all this climate emergency stuff? What's all this climate emergency stuff?" And one woman said, "Well, I think an emergency is knife crime. I think an emergency is poverty." And I do think there needs to be a bigger and greater conversation, including all sorts of people who don't always see climate emergency in the way that some of the people here tonight see climate emergency. But we need to bring them along and bring them with us, because it's our planet that we're talking about. So that as well as being a councillor, I'm a university lecturer, and I teach a course which talks about Victorian England and we look at London and Victorian London. And in Victorian London, we had high levels of poverty, high levels of pollution, high levels of unsafe working and living conditions. And over 100 years later, we are still battling those things. And I do think it's important that when we talk about climate emergency, when we are talking about the Green New Deal, one of your, I think it was Gania, I recognized her voice. She talked about the Green New Deal, and I've met Anne Pettifor, the author of the Green New Deal. When we're talking about this new world, whether we're talking about with COVID as well as with climate change, we've got to address inequality, and we've got to, the most vulnerable in our society have to be a part of it. And we're talking about job creation. We've got to talk about creating great jobs for everyone, whether they are middle class or whether they are the working poor, whatever. And we've got to create a society whereby they can be a part of that green revolution, if you want to call it. But more than anything else, I think for me, it's really important that the conversation or the involvement with climate emergency, or whatever people choose to call it, doesn't just stay here, but it stays in all the different groups, the groups that have been working even before XL in Greenwich. There are so many different groups that have been working on that issue. So for me, I think it's really important that we address inequality, we address safety and health, and we make Greenwich a better place to live, not just for now, but for the future, as well as working in partnership.
Okay, thank you very much, Denise. Thank you to all of our panelists. Just to, we're going to finish now. Just to remind you, we're going to keep on with these online sessions through the summer. We've got one fixed up, which is on the 22nd of June. We will be going on in July and August, and we'll put some details up on our website and on social media shortly. But I can tell you, June the 22nd, easy to remember, it's the day after Midsummer, and we are going to be talking about the International Climate Talks process. Obviously, we thought that there would be a conference of the parties in Glasgow, and now that's been postponed, but the need for cooperation between movements here in the global north and in the global south is not over, and completely agree with people talking about uniting climate justice with social justice. And to talk about all that, we've got Asad Rehman, the Executive Director of War on Want, who's been on this for many, many years, before War on Want at Friends of the Earth and other organizations, a very committed campaigner, very knowledgeable, and it'd be very good to have him on a Zoom call, 22nd of June. I've put the address in the chat, but it's also for Eventbrite. You can also find that on the XR Greenwich site or on our Facebook page. So that's on the 22nd of June. As for the council, we will forward any unanswered questions, and we very much hope to be part of that continuing conversation. And I think that's it. So thank you all very much. And in a few seconds, the meeting will be ended. And see you all on a Zoom call or walking around Plumstead Common in my case very soon. Okay, so thanks to everybody.